Hello and welcome to the webinar. Thank you very much for joining. This webinar is called Lift Off with Splunk RBA, Setting Course for Security Maturity. Part one of a three-part webinar talking about RBA and the journey through RBA, really kind of making sure that everyone can become more secure using risk-based alerting. So hopefully that's what you're expecting. Just a little bit about me. My name is Ben Marrable. I'm a senior security strategist here at Somerford Associates. I've dealt with Splunk technology for many years now, proficient within the entire security suite at Splunk. I'm also a qualified CISP as well. So just a quick about the plan for the webinar. First off, we're going to talk about what RBA is, right? This is the sort of groundwork that we're going to be thinking about. Why are we even looking at RBA? What is RBA? How does it work? We're going to structure an RBA development path, kind of figure out how we're going to go about actually progressing through an RBA journey and developing our security operations to use RBA. We'll talk about prerequisites and the components to meet RBA and what part of Splunk's enterprise security suite actually is required to be RBA, obviously the risk framework, but there are other parts as well that we need to know about. And we'll talk about getting started. This is getting started. This is the first journey, the first piece of an RBA plan. So we're going to start from level one, getting started. In the future webinars, we'll talk about progressing further than that. So alert volumes are overwhelming SOCs, right? So they are so many different alerts that are hitting the security operations center, many of them being abandoned or suppressed, or just leads to slow detection response and analyst burnout. And we know that if we can rotate through use case incidents more rapidly, we'll be able to get through more better events and become more secure. So how does risk-based alerting actually work then? So first off, we've got correlations, correlation searches, much like we had with previously with the general notable events and the notable event framework in Splunk Enterprise Security. Now we have these correlations, but rather than just creating a notable in the notable index, they now create risk events in the risk index. Okay, and when they do that, they have a score that's applied. They annotate the information, and we're really looking for outliers here in general about behavior. Now, that outlier behavior might just be that someone's started a new role in this organization. It's nothing suspicious at all. However, their behavior has changed, so we should take note of it. So we are always looking for these sort of use cases that are detecting things that are unusual. Okay, so that's how we then build this risk index, and we start assigning risk to users, to systems, to applications, whatever it is, some sort of entity. And then once the risk thresholds are hit, or a number of different types of risk events occur, then we alert on it. So the risk analysis framework really provides the ability to identify actions that raise the risk profile of individuals or assets, and that's the key thing really. So we're using this risk concept to really increase the risk profile, and then when we hit thresholds, then we alert. So how does it really work in practice? Well, we're going to get multiple events, right? So we're going to have, let's say, a potential spear phishing observed. Now, this is potential, right? Doesn't mean it is, but it's possible. It looks a little bit suspicious. Let's add a certain element of risk or a certain amount of risk to that particular user. Then we might be seeing suspicious software running on that computer. So right, maybe this was spear phishing on a computer or so forth, and then a suspicious commands being run or disabled, PowerShell being observed, services being installed, and then lateral movement. Now, these probably are quite low points of risk here, but the idea here is that they all add up to about 100 points, and 100 points being our threshold. When we hit that, you can see this has happened throughout the day. It's not just a one-time event. It's occurring throughout a larger period of time, in this case, several hours, but it could be a 24-hour window that we're looking at risk, or it could be a 7-day window, or it could even be a 30-day window. And then once it hit that 100 points, then we actually hit a risk incident rule, right? So that's generating an alert. It's exceeded 100 points over a 24-hour period. We now alert on it, and we now want to know about it. And we can see all of this in the alert, right? That's another key benefit of using an RBA approach, having an extra layer of correlation on top, is that now we can see all of this historical events in one place, in one click, to be able to see everything, which is really key. This allows us to increase the coverage, but also decrease the alerts, right? So we can look at things that we weren't previously able to look at that might be suspicious just because, you know, they created too many events. But we are reducing the number of alerts because we're correlating things together. Another layer of correlation, really. So key things to actually starting to use RBA. So now that we understand how RBA works and what it is, one of the first things that we need to be thinking about is getting initial buy-in, right? So we need to make sure that leadership understands the value of RBA so that they can commit time and resources to it. We need to have the engineering team being able to commit time to be able to build RBA use cases and working through the methodology to it. We need to have an idea from the analysts that are in the organizations. We want to get them involved as quickly as possible so they know how to start dealing with a risk event as opposed to a standard notable, how that kind of looks differently, what they want to be doing in terms of a playbook to respond to it. And then even if we've got red, blue, purple teams involved as well, that would be great because they can assist in actually creating new rules. Okay, so getting that buy-in from all these stakeholders can be really crucial to making sure that the RBA process is a success in your organization. We also need to set goals, right? What are we trying to actually achieve with RBA? Okay, are we trying to increase the quality of the alerts? Are we trying to reduce the number of alerts because we're just getting too much noise? Okay, are we trying to make sure that we annotate everything so that MITRE is really important? Just making sure that we've got that. Then also we can look from a longer term perspective, right? Making sure that we can integrate with Splunk's threat intelligence management, or we can expand on what we were doing previously within this SOC and start looking at fraud use cases or other types of use cases using RBA, right? So getting a larger picture of what we're trying to do. If we've got that, then that gives us a good stead of what we're trying to achieve. And then it's all about making sure that we have a plan to build and execute this, right? So making sure that we understand how everything works, and then we can kind of structure a plan to run it. Okay, so it's really important to think of it as a project. Have a project manager if you can, have some goals and understand where that kind of process really needs to work and the kind of step-by-step processes through it. So what do we need to do first? Well, one of the key things is to set expectations, right? Now, first off, RBA might have more alerts. If you start turning on RBA for the first point, you may create more alerts. That's okay. It's an iterative process, right? We're not expecting it to work straight out of the box as soon as possible when we start creating, because we might be using new use cases we weren't previously. It's not a magic solution, doesn't do everything for your alerting problems, okay? But it can be a very powerful weapon in your arsenal, okay? It can really help, and it can also expand what you can do into your security operations within the resources that you have available to you. It may challenge existing expectations of detection and response. It's no longer, I've detected something, here's a response playbook. Sometimes it's that response has to be a little bit longer because there's more things involved in it, right? So the sort of standard expectation of reducing the amount of time to respond to an alert might actually increase, right? So there are things that do change, but it's just understanding it. And then one of the key things that is really important to understand, it doesn't need to be 100% perfect before you start using it, right? You can don't have to tweak every risk score to the right nth degree. It's just getting it an extra layer of that correlation involved to really reduce the alerts down. So it doesn't have to be perfect. You can tune it. It's iterative. You go through it over and over again. So what do we need to actually make RBA work? First off, we need Splunk Enterprise Security. It is not going to work without Splunk Enterprise Security. So if you're just a core Splunk customer, then we might want to think about looking at Splunk Enterprise Security. We're going to need good asset identity frameworks. I mean, if you've been on my previous webinars, I talk a lot about assets and identities and making sure that they're very important because they're fundamental in how enterprise security really works. For risk, they are critical, right? Without them, we won't be able to correlate everything to a particular asset or an identity. We don't have that correlation engine for assets and identities or entities there. So we really need that asset identity frameworks working. And then also, if we've got a safe search inventory or use case register to understand what we're trying to run and where those use cases are, and if they're partaking in risk or if they're partaking in direct notables or atomic notables, some people will say, just having an understanding of what that's going to be and what we're looking for. So what makes up RBA? Well, risk objects, right? So anything that gets applied risk, the risk scores that apply to those. So risk objects being assets, identities, could be applications, could be certificates, could be services, processes, could be a number of different things, but ultimately and primarily there'll be assets and identities, users and systems. Okay, the risk scores that apply, risk rules with their corresponding risk scores, but the risk scores may vary out the output of the risk rule with the risk messages. Risk messages are really key to for the analyst to understand what it is that's actually occurred here. So when you see a risk notable, you're actually going to see a snippet of, this has occurred. You're not going to get all the fields that this particular risk rule has occurred. You're going to get, hopefully, a very detailed risk message that tells you exactly what's happened at this time. Yeah, so I've connected to this many systems, normally I connect to 3 or something like that, right? So that the analyst actually understands that that's why it's triggered. We'll have risk notables. So these are the things that come out the other end. So much like a normal notable, but these are developed by risk. And we have risk incident rules that trigger those risk notables, right? So Splunk Enterprise Security comes with 2 out of the box, and we'll talk about enabling them in this today. You could increase and look at other ones, which we'll talk about later, but you need to understand that there are risk rules and risk incident rules that trigger on those risk rules. Then we have risk annotation, so making sure that everything's annotated so that we can use that as a trigger point instead of just risk scores. We have risk scoring, the process, the sort of structure to risk scores that are being applied, and risk modifications. So these are risk factors, things that might adapt the risk as it goes. So there's a number of different components to an RBA program, and we just need to understand what each of those are, which hopefully I've detailed there. So we're at level 1, right? Hayley Mills has put out a very good, she's from Splunk, she's put out a very good white paper of processes to develop an RBA journey, and I'm going to be using much of her content here in the conversation really. But we're going to start at level 1, okay? That's the basis for this particular webinar, right? Where we're talking about getting started with RBA, using standard Splunk ES features, becoming familiar with risk rules, risk incident rules, and we're going to start, having a content strategy, activating default rules in a test mode, and then monitoring the results. That's the general step to get going to start with, okay? It is not going into production at this point. It is just getting used to it, getting familiar with how RBA works. Okay, so time for a demo. So let me just switch over to a Splunk environment. This is Splunk Enterprise Security, and the page that I've actually come to start with is under Security Posture, SOC Operations. And the reason I wanted to come in here is I don't normally come in here in many of my demos, but it does highlight dispositions that might be used. So hopefully your enterprise security is running in production and you are actively assigning dispositions, or your analysts are actively assigning dispositions to all the notable events that are being generated. When you've been able to do that, if you scroll down on this page, you'll see all those different dispositions that might be applied, right? So we've got a number of false positives here, we've got a number of true positives, benign positives, suspicious but expected behavior, that sort of thing. So we are ongoing tagging effectively all of our notables and the sources that generate those notables as being whether they're contributing false positives or true positives and so forth. This is really useful because it gives us a platform to start from when we want to develop RBA, right? So we could run a search that essentially looks at these dispositions, there's a search on the screen, takes the sources that are generating the dispositions and then counts the number of false positives compared to the total that have been analyzed and closed off, right? And then that gives us a benign rate of how many we have got in terms of false positives for that particular use case, right? Or that particular risk rule. And anything that's sitting over about 50% is a great candidate to think about using for risk, right? If your analysts are generally spending over 50% of the time dealing with this and just flagging it off as a false positive, it's very possibly a better in RBA and certainly anywhere near 100%. So this is a demo data set. It's got very few in here, but hopefully in your environment, you've got a much wider period of time to analyze these use cases and see what's generating false positives, see what's generating true positives, and then be able to divide which ones should go into RBA versus which ones should go into standard direct atomic notables because they are true positives and we want to deal with them straight away. So yeah, I'll be able to get this search hopefully another time, but if not, you can see it on the screen there. Once we've got that, we've got an idea of what we're trying to use, right? So the first point of call that we want to be doing is turning on the 2 correlation searches out of the box that trigger risk rules, right? So that is the risk threshold exceeded for an object over a 24-hour period. So here we've got a search that generates and looks over a 24-hour period and looks for risk rules and then triggers on a threshold of 100 points, right? So where the risk score is greater than 100 points, it will trigger. Now, to start with, we might want to we don't want to alert our analysts. We don't want to get our analysts involved. So what we can do is add a QA equals 1, right? Statement on the end. So this notable is going to be generated with a field value combination of QA as in quality assurance, right? Or QA status point. So we've got a QA equals 1. We can then filter anything that's got QA as a notable out of the system so that the analysts don't have to deal with it. Alternatively, we can tell them and get them involved and say, we're making risk notables now. So you don't need to worry about risk notables, you just worry about normal notables. There are many different ways of doing this. This is Haley Mills' way, so I'm just going to show it through here. So we'll add in QA equals 1 to this risk notable. And the same for the second risk notable. These are 2 out of the box. So this one's the attack tactic threshold exceeded for an object over previous 7 days. It's looking at a larger period and it's counting the number of tactics that are involved, being greater than 3, greater than or equal to 3, and the number of actual risk rules or sources. So this is 4. Okay, so this is different actual risk rules triggering on a particular asset or identity or risk object really. And then again, I put in the QA equals 1 and save that off. To then be able to exclude things that have QA equals 1 from the analyst viewpoint, we would come into the search macros and we would come into the get notable index macro and we'd just change it to say not QA equals 1. Okay, so be very clear, it's not QA not equal to 1. I'm sure you're all aware of the differences between not and QA not equals, being one has to have the field value. This one does not have to have QA equals anything. Okay, so this will then is used on incident review on everywhere else that's just going to get the notable. So this is using the index equals notable naturally, so we can save that off, and that will exclude any notable that's got QA equals to 1 inside it. So you've got a way of doing a testing process, putting notables into a production that have quality assurance to be done, so that then you can run them in line to a production environment, get them to trigger, review them, tune them, do all the sort of processing that you need to do and to them before you then make them live and go to production by turning off the QA equals 1 piece. Okay, so that's the sort of process that we can do to get rid of notables and to tune them out that way. Now, the second thing that you need to think about is the risk factor editor, right? So we have risk rules that are generating. We've got the list of all of those, and we can add risk to the bottom of a rule. And then what we can do is then change the risk score that's being applied, right? So at this point, we're not concerned too much about how much risk score is being applied, right? And out of the box, you're going to get a lot of rules that have a risk score kind of done for you. And we're going to sit with that. Next webinar, we'll talk about what a risk scoring framework should really look like and tuning the risk scores. Right now, we just want to turn it on and get it running, okay? And just measure the effectiveness of it. Okay, so don't worry too much about what the risk score is, but what you do want to think about is apply a risk score and also add some risk factors so that things can be manipulated depending on it's being a critical priority destination or a high priority user, or it's on a watch list. All these different things, you can add in some others. You've got contractor users, so just enable them as they are, I would say, for now. And then, we're all about just turning things on, getting used to it and understanding how RBA really works. So this will then adaptively change our risk scores when they get generated on high priority users, critical destinations, watch listed users or admins or contractors. All of these different things they will alter the risk factors. You may also want to have critical priority user and high priority destination added in as well, just to make sure you've got a clear kind of overlook of everything. Okay, so then we've got some adaptation going on. Now, once we've got to this point and we've got the risk scores in, right, and they're going to be generic, as I say, don't worry too much about them. Then we're going to start thinking about what we can do after this and actually and analyze it, right? And to make sure that we're going to monitor what's going on. So one of the first point of calls to do that is the risk analysis dashboard. You can find that under Security Intelligence, risk analysis. Just while I'm here, just in case you're wondering where risk factor editor is, it's under configure risk factor editor. That's the previous page I showed. So under risk analysis, you can see all the distinct risk modifiers, the risk objects, aggregated risk scores. You can see the most active sources, and this panel will be really useful in terms of tuning and making sure that we're applying the right amount of risk scores and all that sort of thing, and where the risk scores are being applied, and then all the different sort of annotations that are being applied to risk scores as well, and all the risk actually what's generating it and all sorts. So this is your sort of first point of call, just checking where risk is being applied and check that it is being applied, right? If for every reason you're not seeing things on this dashboard, or if you just want to go a bit deeper, then what you can do is go and have a look at index equals risk, right? This is where risk events are going to occur, right? This is where you're going to see the results of your risk rules, which are your correlation searches, your previous use cases that you've switched to doing risk. And just to be clear, right, if it was running in atomic notables and you want to start using risk, you can still keep both adapt to response actions, right? You can still have an atomic notable being generated and create risk and start measuring that the risk framework will do what it needs to do before you turn off those direct notables. You've got all your annotations you can see extracted here. You've got the risk objects, the risk object types. So we've got system risks here, we've got user risk, and we've got risk scores being applied each time. So, they vary between 1 and 100 because obviously your trigger point's 100. So, you want to just make sure it sort of, makes sense as to what the score is. And then you can adapt it, right? And it's all about measuring how it's working and it's going correctly, and then we'll start thinking about adapting. And then finally, you'll see indexing the index equals notable. You'll see source threshold exceeded. You'll see the two different sources, the 7-day attack tactic threshold, the 24-hour risk threshold. You'll also now see, because you've set QA, you'll see QA equals 1 in your events as well. So you know that that's going to be excluded from your incident review page, and all your analysts aren't necessarily going to look at it. But that's the underlying piece. So you want to just make sure that's the case. And then you can see all the things that are coming out the other end of this particular risk incident rule, including all the sources that generated it, the original sources fields, so these are the use cases that generated the risk incident rule accumulated together. So that's pretty much the demo for now. Right, we've gone through a few things. So let me just close off. So just in summary, right, what we've gone through in this particular webinar is what is RBA, right? Hopefully you've got an understanding and grasp of what RBA is and how it can be useful for you. Now, hopefully you can see it being a project. That's a good key kind of driver from this webinar. Really just understand that it should be taken as a project. You should have goals, you should have expectations. You need to get buy-in from the senior management. You need to get buy-in from your engineering team. You need to get buy-in from the analysts to make sure that everybody understands what's going to be happening. Make sure you understand it's an iterative process, right? We are adding it in, we are then tuning it, we're then reviewing it, we're then tuning it, we're then reviewing it, we're tuning it. And as you tune it, the more cycles you go through of that, the better and better it's going to be, and the more reliant you can get on it, and the more value it's going to provide for you. Understand what content's going to go into risk-based alerting. It doesn't have to be everything, and in many cases it won't be everything. Work from a small subset of use cases to start with, right? Start from the noisy ones, right? I gave you that search. Hopefully you saw the search. You can start from those noisiest ones that are creating the most false positives as a percentage. Start bringing those into your risk-based alerting piece, and start with a small subset and start working from there and measuring the effectiveness of it, and then keeping it as iterative as possible, expanding new use cases into the RBA methodology. And remember, it doesn't have to be perfect to go into production, right? The goal at this point is not to make it perfect, and even when you do run it in production, it's iterative. It's never going to be perfect because there's always another layer that you can go on top of it, right? It does require some engineering, should be looked at as a project, but it does not have to be perfect to be used and useful, right? Some resources for you. As I said, the Essential Guide to Risk-Based Alerting, done by Hayley Mills at Splunk, and it will go over a lot of the concepts that I've gone through here. Planning for success with RBA, and then roadmap to success with RBA as well. So you've got a few different links there, hopefully, that can get you started on this journey, and hopefully that will help you see and use RBA to your benefit. Otherwise, thank you very much for attending. Here's our links. Hopefully I'll see you on the second part of the webinar, and we'll talk about how we can take RBA from a concept to production.